in digital, please welcome Lola to the stage to deliver her talk, For the Love of Wicked Problems.
Good morning. I'm going to try and not be intimidated by how many of you there are out there, so if I stumble a little bit, please forgive me, be kind. I am Lola Oyelayo. I am Director of Strategy and User Experience at an agency called Head. For those of you who are kind of still at your early UX education years, what it essentially means is I'm one of the many people who've migrated from wireframes to suddenly have to fight, defend, and make a business case for user experience with a lot of our clients. So having to deal with some pretty difficult problems and challenges and reasons why things don't necessarily go the way we want it to go when it comes to doing making a really great digital product, should I say. And it's in that capacity that I've developed a little bit of a theory about what I'm choosing to identify as types of wicked problems. Now, I always say when you come to a conference, there are two things you want to do. You want to either learn something completely new that you never ever knew before and it blew your mind and you're thinking about it in totally different ways, or you want to gain a perspective. So what I'm trying to do today is provide a perspective. It's not necessarily going to be like groundbreaking science, but hopefully it will empower the kinds of conversations you can have with your teams, with your colleagues, if you're agency side with your client, if you're in-house with your kind of product owners, and just have different ways of tackling the problems that come through. So, and apologies, this is the only Wizard of Oz reference, just because wicked, you know. So what I'm going to go through today, if that works, no it doesn't, okay. Oh, there it does. So four things in my talk. Firstly, what makes a problem wicked? Secondly, the kinds of wicked problems that we are responsible for. And I've purposely used this phrase that we are responsible for. This is about taking ownership of the challenges that we think we would normally want to blame on other things. The future problems we'll need to address, and this is just applying some context, maybe building on Boon's talk a little bit about situations and scenarios that as UX practitioners, the reality of our domain is becoming inherently more complicated, and there's not a lot we can do about that, but it's going to challenge us. And then 3 tips that in my experience have made it a little bit easier to tackle these issues, but again, it's not a panacea, it's not a quick fix, but just ways of thinking about it so that you can try and work through it a little bit better. So firstly, what makes a problem wicked? So wicked problems is actually, it's a socio-economic phrase. It comes from sociology, anthropology. It's actually normally about the study of human problems and social policy. So the context that we're used to seeing wicked problems defined in are issues like poverty, education, and unemployment, crime, housing. These are things that affect humans, affect the way governments design policies, affect the way that we experience our different services in life. Now, the reason that these things tend to come up a lot or have ended up being classified as wicked problems is that you can't really tackle one without uncovering symptoms of the other. So essentially, a wicked problem is wicked not because it's got magic, but because there is a sense that it resists solution. It is very resistant to being fixed. So if you wanted to tackle a topic like, let's try and solve childhood poverty, you may go into the home of a child that's living below a particular amount and find that you've got parents who are unemployed. You may have some evidence of crime or a criminal history which is affecting their ability to be employed. You may find that there's a lack of education and that has also affected their ability to be employed, or they're homeless and there are housing issues that are affecting their ability to apply for a job in the first place. And all of these things are contributing, they're all symptoms of this issue of childhood poverty. So it's not the single issue that you can tackle, it's actually the interrelation between all of these issues. And the thing about wicked problems is you never quite fix them. So a lot of us have, if we're kind of politically inclined, we'll have moments where we have conversations with people and it's like, oh, the problems we have today are because of Margaret Thatcher and all her crazy policies, and the bankers are doing what they're doing because of Tony Blair and all that new Labour stuff. These are all examples of social policy decisions or political decisions that were made in the context, trying to tackle types of wicked problems because they're human issues. But when you go down the line and you get into the future state, you realize that the solution at the time potentially created its own problems in today's land. And you can't see that coming. You basically have to do your best at any point in time. And so you come back to this idea of the wickedness of the issue, the fact that it's just really resistant to being fixed in a really simple way. Now, when I was doing research into this talk, I came across somebody else who'd kind of come from a design and UX background and had been tackling wicked problems. And that was this young chap called John Colco, who's an ex-Frog designer. And he's got this great book that I bought called Wicked Problems Worth Solving. And his approach is to look at these wicked problems in society and say, as designers, actually, we've got amazing tools for understanding context, for unpicking a problem, for putting things back together in such a way that maybe the solutions are a little bit more robust, a little bit more resistant to some of the challenges that they would face. And what I really like about the book is that, number one, he talks about us being socially conscious as designers, but equally he presents some tools and tips and techniques and things that allow you to help social context improve the way these wicked problems are tackled. I've got this slightly cheeky take-a-pick thing there, just because if I don't spend long enough on a slide, because I'm not going to read them out, this is a tip for this is the memorable stuff that you might want to take away. But I'm not telling you what to do. So in his book is also where I first came across a guy called Horst Himmel. And Horst Himmel is a sociologist from the 70s. Well, obviously, I think he's still alive. But in the 70s, he did some work to define the symptoms, the characteristics of complex social issues. And I won't read this out, but there are a few that I think will give you a clue as to why I've started to think about wicked problems in a particular way. So wicked problems have no definitive formulation. I've already mentioned poverty, but if you take issues behind poverty in Midwestern USA and you wanted to tackle poverty in that context, you couldn't then take that exact same model to Central Africa to tackle poverty, because it's not the same. The symptom is poverty, but the reasons behind it and the context you're designing for are not the same. So you can't just make that solution fit a different context. There is no template to follow. So linking back to what Boomer says, this idea of best practice, this idea of templates or examples of what people have done before, of history teaching us. Wicked problems don't necessarily give you the best route forward. They only tell you what happened before and lots of things that didn't work and other things that maybe worked a little bit better. But there is no rule book that allows you to say, I've got a comfortable path about how I solve this. There's always more than one explanation for a wicked problem. So again, linking back to my example earlier on, you can talk about the number one reason for childhood poverty is a lack of education in their parents. But equally, you could say it's a lack of employment. Both things are true. You wouldn't be wrong if you made any claim on any one of those issues. But the problem is the issue has lots of symptoms that are all playing a significant part in how this problem is expressed. Every wicked problem is a symptom of another. I think that's also quite fair. And the final one, designers attempting to address a wicked problem must be fully responsible for their actions. And that's something that I think is really important, and that's the real nub of my talk. And this is the context that I want to apply to our digital world. Is that actually when it comes to digital, we are responsible for creating and participating in the development of a number of wicked problems that affect us, that affect our end users, that affect the experience of the product, that affect the future designers and developers who are going to be working on that product. So let's look at that a little bit. So what makes a problem wicked in our digital context? So I've coined a term which I'm calling the wicked digital quartet. I like branding things a little bit, but just bear with me. Now, these are, in my personal experience, these are four significant factors that at different levels, in different projects, in different environments, in different products, play a role in creating a really messy pot of issues that are really difficult to solve by saying, let's just build a new version, because it doesn't really work. That's not the answer to these issues. So the first one is, I'm going to learn how to use this. Okay, legacy technology. Now, unless you're one of the very, very, very few people who has the fortune to work in a team where you are building something completely greenfield from scratch, most of us are working in environments where we are building a new version of product X. We are re-platforming service Y. We are trying to improve the experience of product Z. We are always facing, therefore, if we're working in large businesses or businesses that have been around for a long time, or the charity sector or environment or healthcare, where there's not a lot of investment necessarily into helping to move as fast as a technology can, legacy technology issues. And these issues are really difficult because it's basically recognizing that 25, 30 years ago, people were building things not necessarily thinking that they would last the next 50 years, that they would still be the foundation of the number of various interactions and design solutions that we're trying to build today. They just didn't have that context. And so we're now having to hold our future solutions back by decisions that people made a long time ago. And it's not necessarily always that long ago. I think most of us have had lots of fun working on SharePoint 2007 stuff. But you kind of have a sense that legacy tech has a number of issues that maybe as UX people, you don't know about because you've never had to cope with it. You've not been the person who switches on and off that data store. You've not been the guy who's the DBA. You've not been the one who's got to go to the server room and manually fan a server that's about to fall over because it's overheating. So you're not aware of how those issues are really holding development back. You then add this to digital and technical literacy, specifically at a decision-making level. So unfortunately, you find in a lot of organizations, decisions that are quite significant to a product are made at the least knowledgeable forum. So senior leadership department will decide to go forward. We are embracing lean. We want to disrupt ourselves before we're disrupted. We want these agile cats in. We're going to set a 12-month timetable and we want it done for £100,000. All before a developer or a designer or anyone who's actually functionally ever made a thing has had a conversation with them about whether or not that's realistic. Now, it's not those forums' fault that they don't have that knowledge within them. But the issue is, once those decisions are made, they are inherent constraints that exist when you say, we need an extra iteration on this particular design solution, or we need to go for another usability test, or we're not quite cracking it, we've got to go forward, and they say, we've run out of money, we've run out of time, it's got to be presented, you're done. So you've just got to live with it. And what happens is you live with it, and then that issue, or that temporary hack, or that thing that you're not quite happy with, becomes a bottleneck or an issue for the next generation, the next iteration of design solutions that's got to be built on top. The third is finance, and that's a dirty word in some senses. So it's not that, I was having a conversation yesterday, it's not that as UX people we now all need a kind of an accounting qualification, or we need to understand what management accounts do or how budget cycles do. But we do need to be conscious of the fact that the way finance works is now completely out of sync with the way in which we need to be working. So I know in one example, a client of mine, they had a 6-week procurement process so that we could buy 10 gig of extra space in the cloud. And that just doesn't make any sense, because if you were at home by yourself, you'd basically whip out your credit card and you would just be able to, increase the space in a second. But it went through 6 weeks of procurement because it's not a process that fits with the way we want to work. And unfortunately, again, for finance, they're at the top end of the funnel. They're part of that decision-making that's been done. It's, I've got to make this budget work. People need paying. I haven't got any more money. I can't do this without the due diligence that comes into it. And the final part of the quartet, and maybe less popular than I would like it to be, is actually the fact that we've gone agile. So now more than ever before, we've decided that we just need to get started. We need just-in-time information. We've got just enough information. We'll fix these issues when we come to it later on. We just got to get going. And we're stuck with a deadline that's been set by someone else. We're stuck with a budget that's been set by someone else. We're stuck with a technology that's been set by someone else. So when in week 3, your product owner, who, bless them, may or may not be as empowered as they should be, given that it's still quite a new discipline, finds that we cannot solve this particular issue in the time that we've got, the only route they have is not to go and ask for more money, although some lucky few can, is to say, you've got to find another way around it. You've got to do something else. We've got to hack this right now. We've got to get creative. What are the other routes? What are the other options? As Boone says, you start looking at your hunches, your 5-minute pieces of research that you can do just to see if you can come up with an idea. But there is no guarantee that it's the best solution. And certainly, if that then becomes the bottleneck that you face in the next iteration, unfortunately, you've just got to deal with that. because that was the situation you were in. Now, how this plays out can be slightly different, but I want to use an example of a client I worked with recently, but I won't be naming them. At a very high level, you don't have to read it all, but a 100-year-old institution. So you can imagine the types of business evolution and changes that they've seen in 100 years of being business. But their biggest challenge is going digital and actually taking a lot of what they do online. And they were falling behind and had lots of end-of-life tech, like SharePoint 2007, and issues that meant that they just had servers falling over. So they made a decision, they set a budget, they set a time frame, they decided they wanted it all in the cloud. They managed to run a procurement process, selecting a CMS, a strategic support, a systems integrator, got all of the people in and were like, right, we're moving forward now, we can hit our deadline. Bear in mind, most of those strategic decisions were made before anyone had built a prototype or tried to say, what is an example of the service and can we actually build it? Do we have a very tangible working model for what it is to build this for a 100-year-old institution? Day one, the transformation team had 60 people in it. 60 people at stand-ups on the phone. Some onshore, some near shore. Many of their internal staff had attended a lunchtime session on Agile and thought they were ready for it and knew what it meant. And you can imagine the kind of drama that ensued over the coming 6 weeks when everyone was scrambling to meet the board's timeline that had been set a year earlier to show them an MVP, right? That's what MVP is. We've gone lean. We can do that, right? We can so do this. An example of the type of wicked issue we faced was actually with this particular, one of their first products. They had a data store that had millions of records in it. And each one of these records, essentially, you can consider it currency. So to pick a record means essentially saying somebody's going to be paid a certain amount of money because that record has been used in this particular application. But in that same store, you have hundreds of thousands of entries that are just hello, another 100,000 that are goodbye, another 100,000 that are tomorrow. So the accuracy was actually really key because unless you get the specific one that's associated to an individual, that individual does not get paid. So their old system was an Excel spreadsheet that you filled in yourself and it kind of was mistyped and then you emailed it to somebody and they tried to do a lookup and do some Googling and try and correct the errors. Our solution was simple. You do a type ahead lookup, allow you to do a search with a number of facets and job done. We just, make it super simple, mobile friendly. It's not a hard thing to design. Except that nobody knew that a strategic decision had been made that meant that this data store was technically the property of another organization. It was also held on an Oracle database that lived in a physical location. Now, for the developers in the room, trying to do something like a type-ahead lookup on an Oracle database that had a physical manifestation and was updated once every 48 hours is the equivalent of trying to run a marathon with one leg behind your back. It's just not possible. So we tried to hack it. We said, let's see if we can find any solutions to this. Can we do something else? Can we build something on the top? And we did an experiment. We did a spike over 3 days. And the best solution was actually combining a mix of open source technologies with some of the kit that we were already using on the product. Except a strategic decision had been made for security reasons to not use open source technologies. So guess what happens is you end up with a new version of this form going online that doesn't actually solve the core problem that everyone had, which is it's very easy to get the wrong person paid for something that can be uniquely identified in a data store. And again, as a UXers who were working on the project, you don't necessarily know that's going to be the thing that's going to hold you back, because if someone says it's a form with some records and you can do a lookup, you're just like, cool, we can do a lookup, right? But all of these issues were so interweaved within the business, and it's not a criticism. They weren't necessarily bad decisions when they were made, but they resulted in a pretty wicked scenario for those of us working on this product to say, how do we deliver against requirements? How do we meet the time frame? How do we solve this problem? We've got so many issues, each of which are pulling us in different directions. And when you look at it, you can see it's kind of various elements of the wicked quartet were at play in that particular context. And it's not necessarily, again, I said, it's not one of these was the main issue. You can't come in and say, well, it's because it was all legacy tech. It's because all the decisions were this. It's because we were moving too fast. It's not. Each one of them played its own role and just making it a really, really difficult scenario. And the thing is, we're only ever going to be ever more facing these kinds of scenarios. And the way it looks to the end user, the way they experience it from us, and it's going to sound really simple when I say these are the symptoms that they see, but they have to deal with slow lookups and searches, like the scenario I just described. They've got to deal with badly loading pages. They've got to deal with page disharmony. They've got to deal with missing content. And you'll sit there and you'll be like, well, we did do the right things. We did try and do it. But actually what you find is that you didn't go back far enough. You didn't actually understand where that challenge was going to come in. We didn't expect that the development team would make their own decision because they didn't have an answer from you about a way to tackle a problem that actually they were aware of, but you weren't. And there are two big reasons that this happens. The first is a systemic failure. So we talk a lot about discovery, we talk about doing the user research, we talk about starting from requirements documents. What I see again and again is a lot of this places a huge amount of emphasis on the ideal state we are designing for. But very few people take a critical view on the current systemic context that we are operating in. So have you mapped the journey for the information, the data that's going through this system that you are designing for, as well as you've mapped the pain points for the end user? Do you understand the challenge that a developer is going to be facing when they're going to be trying to optimize this new experience and solve this pain point? Are you part of the solution with them? And the second failure is individual. It's essentially whether or not we, as designers ourselves, are exploring our skill set as part of a combined development team. Now, Agile has made this easier because definitely we know we work hand in hand with developers. Many of us are definitely spending more time talking to the people who are building the designs that we're making. But you still get this weird thing, I designed it, they dumped it, they reprioritized my sketches, they reprioritized my designs, it's not my fault, it doesn't work. There's still this sense of I'm blameless because they didn't do their job. These are two failures, and we're responsible for kind of contributing to this idea that it's not our fault or that it's somebody else's fault. Now, this is only going to get worse, realistically, and Boone already alluded to it. Desktop, mobile, and web, forget about it. They don't mean anything. Do not become a responsive web design specialist because who the hell knows if that's going to be the right design paradigm in 3 years' time. Right? Mark Zuckerberg is demoing virtual reality things. We're talking about augmented reality. What the hell do we call that design paradigm? What does it mean to design for that particular context? It's certainly not a desktop. It's certainly not web. And it might be kind of mobile, but that's a bit weird as well. Apps don't mean anything because they live across all of our different devices. So you can't become a UI specialist in any one of these places. You've suddenly got to expand your toolkit much, much more broadly than you have before. The second is that quant now equals qual. Now, initially you can say, here are the analytics, this is what people are doing, but we don't know why. But there is increasing intelligence that says we know what people are doing, and we can, if we are able to access the data, if we're able to interrogate it appropriately, infer why to a high level of certainty. Now, that creates an expectation on the user that you're going to give me an experience that suits my ability to give you the right information. You're going to use the data I give with you responsively and proactively to make my experience better. And Amazon is setting that expectation. If you search for a product on Amazon, even if you don't put it into your basket, in many scenarios, they've used a crazy set of algorithms to determine the likelihood you will actually buy that item. And they've already triggered a process to bring that item to a distribution center close to where you live. And they're so confident in their algorithms that that doesn't lose them money, because most of the time, they're right. Now, if that's the expectation, you can't tell me I've got to wait 5 days for something that I think you should have, especially when you know I'm interested in it, because I've visited your site 6 times in the last 6 weeks to look at this same item, right up until payday. So these expectations are being set, and actually as teams that are developing products, we've got to think about how that expectation is going to be met. And this is a wicked problem in itself. The final one, which is super challenging, is that actually digital inequality is worse than it ever has been. There is so much us and them. I think it was this week, the Nobel Prize winners were 3 British scientists who've innovated around the field of matter. Now, I can't explain what they've done, but I do know that the expected implication is in supercomputing. So processing speeds are going to come down. Big data might be transformed into Mahusive data. Who the hell knows? But these guys have created a paradigm for unbelievable computational capability that still lives in a world where up until 18 months ago, I was part of a team that was designing a messaging service that had to work as well on a 2G feature phone as it did on a 4G smartphone. And I can tell you the compromises were awful, absolutely awful. Did I do the best job I could? Absolutely. But did I do all of the right things? If someone was looking at it now, based on what we did 18 months ago, you'd probably take down every decision we made. Simply because we had to make those compromises. It was a difficult thing to do. If I'm on a 2G feature phone and I'm talking to my friend who's got an amazing smartphone, the latest Samsung, we've still got to be able to communicate. So what do you take away? These are all compromise decisions. These are all really difficult challenges. These are things that are going to cause our engineering functions headache. Elegant code, forget about it. You just got to make it work. You know, is it masses and masses and masses of difficult processes and system journey maps and ways of looking at user behavior? Absolutely. That challenge is one that we've actually got to take on because the world that we're designing for is changing and we are supposed to be at the front of it. We are supposed to take ownership of making those experiences a lot better. So I'll leave you with 3 tips for tackling wicked problems. I keep referencing Boone, but he kind of did a lot of my talk before me. So now they say there's nothing new under the sun, and there genuinely isn't. How many people here have done a HCI degree or master's? Hands up. Okay, keep them up if you studied soft systems methodology. Not a lot of people. Oh, hello. Yes, hi. So I studied HCI at UCL, and one of our modules, and I don't know if it's still a module on the course today, was a topic called soft systems methodology, which was created by this young chap called Peter Checkland, who's from Lancaster University. And his whole model of soft systems methodology was this idea of you cannot design a digital solution that's going to live in a context where you haven't modeled the world view of that context. And that world view includes people. They're not hard, they're not logical. People are soft and they're fluid. The processes they have are soft and they're fluid. And the way these processes affect the technologies that they use create soft systems. So it's not just about the code, it's not just about the UI. I don't know if you can still get this book in the library because when I got it, it was ratty as hell. It was an 80s book. But it got me thinking that he literally had a template for practices that we should be embracing as we're tackling ever more wicked issues. And so my first wicked tip is that idealizing for the end user isn't as valuable to the end user if you haven't understood the context and the constraints you're actually designing for in that situation. So unless you've spent enough time unpicking the current system, trying to build a better system based on a set of user needs, which absolutely you have to have, you're not necessarily making the right judgments about the best way to meet those particular user needs. And 2 techniques that we've iterated. One is called product runway. And that's essentially, rather than trying to build an MVP off the bat, try and build a prototype or a very small working version of a set of particular interactions or flows, and then use those to go and get the business requirements. So you use this working, interactive, semi-thing that you've done, whether it's in Vision or it's been prototyped in code, and then you go and have a conversation with the back end, and you say, right, this is what we think we're aiming for. What are the implications for that? Can we map out how this thing affects all of the processes that contribute to it? And we say it's runway because you're getting ready for takeoff. This will happen before you start your next sprint, your full production sprint, to say we're getting ready for our MVP. The other thing is system journey maps, and I forgot to put it on here, but if you go and get Indy Young's book on mental models, I've always found it's a really great template for what we call journey maps or user journey maps and stuff like that. But essentially, what people want and what people need at the top, and what the system does and how it responds to that at the bottom, but to a really deep system level. Now, I'm not talking about a data architecture diagram or some kind of difficult to comprehend system model. I'm literally talking about where does the information go? If I have said, I have requested this from a transactional platform, what happens to that request? What's the first service that interacts with that request? Where is the information stored? How does that affect the speed at which you might get me an answer? The second wicked tip is a critical one, but it's not okay to have low technical literacy if you call yourself a UX practitioner. Now, I don't believe UX people should code, so that is not what I'm saying. I don't believe designers should code, but I do believe if you are part of a design team, if your role is to deliver a product, to build a thing, you have to have a level of technical literacy about how the team you're working with are going to do that job. So actually having co-location, developer design workshops, that's the way to solve that particular issue. And my final wicked tip is there's no blame game available to you. This isn't an us or them, there's no right or wrong. There might be good or bad right now, but recognize that actually as these problems get ever more wicked, as this world gets ever more complex, we've just got to make it work as best as we can, but it's a collaboration, it's a we scenario. It's something that we contribute to, it's something we take ownership of, it's something that we carry the responsibility and the burden to do the best job we can. And we do that with a very open mind and a set of tools that will hopefully give us that. And customer experience data is a good way of prioritizing. So essentially, just map your failure points, give them a score, rank them, and as you go through your different iterations, come back and say, right, this was our highest point of debt in this particular product. So this is the thing we need to tackle first. It could be, as you solve that one, you create greater debt elsewhere, but that's life. That's what happens when you're kind of looking at product development over the long term. So I've run over a little bit, but I'll leave you with a quote from Einstein. We can't solve the problems we've created with the same thinking we used in creating them, and that's exactly what we are in now. Best practice, forget about it. But we can tackle these wicked problems if we're thinking about it more proactively, if we're being open-minded, if we're not trying to be the expert, but we maintain the same level of curiosity we have about user needs to help us determine the right way to work through all of these different constraints. Thank you very much.
Try not drop the microphone. Okay, so there were some questions that came out of that.
Okay, good.
Thank you for a very good talk. This one's from Chris Compson. He says, most designers here will be working on mostly non-life-changing projects. How do they break into these?
I'm not sure I understand the term non-life-changing. If you're working okay, it's really easy to be flippant about the design team you're in if you think, I'm working in a team that's not delivering anything in healthcare or charity, or we're not breaking the frontiers of technology. But I think the reality is our entire world is augmented by digital services. We don't really have this idea that it's not important anymore, because what you're working on could be a lifesaver, it could be a key utility, it could be something that other people lean on. And without knowing exactly what that particular product is, I do always say you've got to carry the same level of responsibility whether you're working on solving world hunger as you are if you're designing the best retail experience that you can for a luxury brand. The reality is you're still solving complex problems, and you're doing it whether it's to meet someone's basic human needs or to actually delight them and give them that emotional reaction that they want to have with having brought a great item. So I wouldn't say there's a criticism of yourself. You just kind of have to look at it a little bit differently.
If Agile methodology is part of the problem, what's better?
I don't subscribe to this idea that there's anything better. This goes back to this concept of a wicked problem is wicked because it is resistant to solution. That means that you can tackle a symptom at any point, but that doesn't mean that you solve it forever and ever. Agile is way better than we had before, and I'm fairly certain there'll be something else that I haven't defined yet that will come after it. It will still be part of the symptom set you're dealing with at any point in time, so long as there's always an interplay with legacy tech. And bear in mind, the code you're making today could be legacy in 10 years' time. So we don't ever break free from legacy. It's always going to be a factor in our digital products. That's just the reality that we're in. So it's not that there's something better. It's just it is a part of the symptom set that we're facing.
Yeah. Just a couple of weeks ago, I wrote an article about Agile. It kind of went a little bit viral. So if you do want to check it, it's on my personal site, gavinelliott.co.uk. Because the thing, obviously I work at the Department for Work and Pensions, and I meet development teams. When you do speak to them, it's a case of, so what's your ways of working? And it's the whole, do you work on Agile? And you kind of scrunch your face a little bit waiting for an answer. And then you change it to Wagile?
Yeah.
Or is it waterfall?
Yeah.
And the designer in me just keeps cringing and cringing.
Yeah, exactly.
And then how to kind of bring them into the fold to work within an actual Agile, doing Agile. Team, so it's always interesting to find how other people do it.
Yeah.
There was another one from Clive Lavery, a bit of a paraphrase question. You mentioned John Colco. Do you have any thoughts on the work he's doing about the work at the Austin Centre for Design?
I don't.
That was a quick one.
It's a really good question, but I got to know him through reading this book and tweeting him a couple of times, but I've not actually delved into his other works as such. I was kind of very focused on this particular.
So that's a chat that you can have in the break.
Yeah, I'd love to learn about that though, if whoever asked that question has some thoughts.
You mentioned and gave the example of the decisions that led to the 60-person stand-up. Working in government, I know exactly what that's like. Not 60, I've seen large, 60 is just way over the top.
Yeah, it's not.
Designers and core members of a design team are usually the ones with quite a lot of experience.
Okay.
How do we, as those roles, become empowered enough to help make the decisions in the first place that come down from pretty much the top of a company level as it can?
Yeah. So I think that's maybe where you've got to work at it on two fronts. If you're turning up at a stand-up that's already got way too many people in it, it's a bit late in the day to suddenly start to change that, because actually the kind of context has led to that scenario. But I consider it a responsibility of people at my level. So, as Director of Strategy and User Experience, evermore I try and work with a business before they make the budget decision, before they make the deadline decision, to help them say, what should the team look like? What is a realistic goal? And I think those of us who have kind of become more senior in user experience over the last 15 years do and should feel like it's okay to become more literate in business management, because these are decisions that are very real. People's salaries need to get paid, the lights need to be kept on, expectations need to be met, shareholders are applying pressure. These aren't dirty words for design, but actually we need to help contextualize those influences, those pressures, in how to deliver responsible digital products and services. And I think you've got to be able to have a relationship at a very, very senior strategic level in order to just pave the way from that. And it's not always going to work. The reality is if you walk into a 60-person stand-up, you've just got to work with it and hope that you can bring some of these other tips to the table and help to educate people. And slowly more and more people will drop out and you'll end up with an actual core team.
Do you think in the future that we will be able to, because basically the one thing that we see more often on like the top table, if you know what I mean, within a company, is like a chief design officer-esque role. How quickly, or do you see this becoming more of a thing in the future?
To be honest, it's a great thing. Having a chief design officer, having potentially a chief experience officer, as I think Tesco have had. I think what actually, in order for that to take place, and this is a really difficult conversation to have with UX people, in order for that to actually happen at an established large business, if you genuinely want to be the chief design officer at one of the top 100 retailers in the UK, you've got to go to business school. Because at that level, at that C-suite level, you're making decisions that are not just your design practice, but actually they help support the HR functions. They help support, logistics and where the rest of your business takes place. So you have to have a level of business literacy that means you deserve to sit at that particular table. And that's not something that I have seen. UX people don't like that. We do what we do because we want to be creative. But actually, some of us have to take that slight leap into the more commercial side of things with this design thinking hat on, with this customer experience hat on, but become really literate at some of these other issues and talk about it. The customer experience debt that I mentioned, I worked with one of my clients to turn that into a cost so that when she was presenting it to the C-suite, it wasn't we want to make things better by 3 points. It was this level of debt means we are wasting X millions of pounds a year. That's a conversation they don't question. But to get to that level and to be able to do that, you've got to start understanding the maths behind the business. And unfortunately, there's no shortcut. If you don't understand the business and you talk about design and customer experience and it's all you should and this is what's important and people need, these are really important issues, but we are driven by the bottom line. And that's just it. And you've just got to get pragmatic with that and just get on their page, I think. I'm happy to be challenged on that, but...
You do mentoring,
yeah.
And obviously advocate for diversity and things.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about how you mentor and how you've got involved in it? Because I think, personally, it's just a thing of mine. I think that we should have more mentors in our industry.
Yeah.
I think it's one thing that's missing, even at a more senior level.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit how you go about it?
Yeah, so I'm going to flip the script on this idea of privilege a little bit. So the one privilege I have is I'm usually the only black female, one of very few females, so I'm quite noticeable. And so the mentoring has happened almost organically by people who look like me, who want to get into user experience, finding me and saying, hey, can you help me get into this field? And so I've been fortunate to just kind of gravitate towards individuals who recognize that rarity. When it comes to actually mentoring, I think one of the things that has always led me in good stead is I have not had a single career track. So I have worked as a business analyst, and then I did a bit of design, I did a bit of research, and we were talking about UX generalists yesterday, and you might have lots of different ideas about that, but I believe the best UX people have a diversity of range of experiences and then a lean towards a specialism. So you have tried this environment, you've gone in-house and challenged yourself, you've gone agency and challenged yourself, you've built a repertoire of different things, you've regretted some design decisions and then you've excelled at others and then you've decided what you really enjoy doing and then you just start to lean towards that and so have this much more diverse suite of experience. And that's basically what I do when I mentor people is just trying to coach them through what's the work you're doing, how do you get that next role, what are the opportunities to do something a little bit more different and then pushing them towards kind of realizing that a little bit. There are a few institutions that can help with, so UXPA is kind of one where they try and create formalized mentoring schemes. There are a few women in tech ones that you can actually go and say, hey, I want to be a mentor, and people will come to you that way. But I also think just be really open to I think at least 3 of the people I've mentored have basically been Twitter chats that have turned into coffees, that have turned into breakfasts, that have turned into years-long relationships to see them through a particular point in time, and then off they go, and it's fine. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Lola.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.